Hi, I'm Zach Penney, and I'm the Fishery Science Department Manager for the Columbia Intertribal Fish Commission. And today I'm going to provide a snapshot of the Columbia Intertribal Fish Commission. So more than a tradition, the indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest were land-based people, whether it was in the Columbia River or the coastal areas. Oftentimes we talk about existing in these regions since time immemorial, but even by Western science standards, the tribal people of the Pacific Northwest have inhabited this area for more than 15,000 years. And you don't live in an area for 15,000 years without learning something, and you also don't live in an area for 15,000 years by messing it up. And so in that time frame, the tribes and the ecosystem co-evolved. And so like in the Columbia River Basin, definitely the tribes and salmon co-evolved. And through that co-evolution, there was definitely land ethics and philosophies that were developed in tribal culture. One of the ones I find being most ubiquitous among the tribes is that we're just borrowing these resources, and that we have a duty or a covenant with these resources that we need to speak for them for those that cannot. And so it is also part of our identity that we're part of this land. We're not outside of it, and that's part of our identity. And in this slide here, I'm actually showing the Nez Perce Tribe's calendar. You can see that in that calendar, this land is my body, and it identifies different seasonal rounds and different occurrences of whether it's the return of fish or the blooming of different plants for harvest. The Columbia Intertribal Fish Commission is comprised of 4 treaty tribes. The commission itself was formed in 1977, and it is comprised of the Confederated Tribes of the Yakima, Nez Perce Tribe, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla, and the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs. CRITFIC's mission is to ensure a unified voice in the overall management of fishery resources, and as managers to protect reserved treaty rights through the exercise of the inherent sovereign powers of the tribes. And I provide a link to the CRITFIC website right here if you want to take a deeper dive. In 1855, these Columbia River tribes signed treaties with the United States government. That included the Nez Perce, the Walla Walla, Cayuse, Umatilla, Yakima, and Middle Oregon tribes. Similar treaties were signed in the Puget Sound. And it's important to understand that the United States was there to obtain Indian land, not to give land to the tribes. The tribes already had their land by possession by law. So as more settlers came into the Pacific Northwest by the Oregon Trail and other areas, conflicts were happening. And as the United States expanded, this was one of the ways for them to reduce that, those mounting conflicts. So in these treaties, the tribes ceded most of their lands, but they did not relinquish all rights in those ceded areas. One of the ones, especially in the context of fisheries, that's most important is the tribes retain their rights of taking fish at all their usual and accustomed areas. Definitely in the modern context, these treaty rights can often be misinterpreted or misunderstood, and that the tribes have more rights than others, and that the tribes are super citizens, they have more rights than others. But these are usufructuary rights. These were rights that were pre-existing before the states of Oregon, the states of Washington, and Idaho existed. And it's important to think about that. When the treaties were signed, that the tribes were not granted new rights. If anything, the tribes were granting rights away. And it's also important to understand this is not a racial issue. Yes, if you're going to label as a demographic, these tribes are Native Americans, but these treaties were signed because these tribes were sovereign nations, not because they were Native Americans. And so these are agreements between 2 sovereigns. For the 4 tribes, I'm showing a map here of the Columbia River Basin, which is outlined here. In the lighter regions for the ceded lands of the 4 tribes, Nez Perce, Umatilla, Warm Springs, and Yakima, and in these darker areas here, you can see what the current reservation boundaries are. So over 66,000 square miles were ceded, and that's more than 25% of the entire Columbia River Basin. Again, this is significant in a modern context in that 55% of the rivers and streams that are still accessible to salmon and steelhead exist within the ceded territory of the 4 treaty tribes. And so that includes almost all of the salmon habitat that's currently above Bonneville Dam. The Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee dams stopped passage of fish into the upper Columbia, and the Hells Canyon complex between the state of Idaho and Oregon stopped steelhead and salmon passage into their historical areas in southern Idaho, as well as some going, I think, as far as even Nevada. So treaty rights and fishing, in terms of how treaty rights have shaped fisheries management, as well as a lot of different aspects of how we utilize different resources in the Pacific Northwest. The right of taking fish became the subject of numerous court opinions due to various conflicts, even after the treaties were signed. And actually, no fewer than 7 U.S. Supreme Court opinions between 1905 and 1979. And you could spend an entire semester going over these cases, and I think there are actually some working colleges that do have curriculum devoted to these. But important point I want to make here is that between the time the treaties were signed to definitely the 1980s, there was a lot of things not going well for tribes or salmon. Salmon were in precipitous decline, either due to overfishing, damage to the tributaries, their spawning tributaries, the impact of the hydro system. A lot of choices were made over salmon for different things, whether it be commerce, agriculture, industrialization of other things like that. But when the tribes ended up going to court, they were victorious in all of these court cases, almost all these court cases, in that if the United States understands one thing, it understands its own property rights laws. And so treaties being the supreme law of the land, the tribes use this as a leverage to get back into the co-management status, and that's ultimately shaped a lot of where we're at today. So tribal co-management, as I noted earlier, CRTFIC was established in 1977. This was shortly followed by the Northwest Power Act of 1980, which helped define and provide the structure for how this co-management framework would work. So the states and individual tribes share co-management in the tributaries, and the states and federal government and tribes share management in the main stem Columbia River. And looking at the authorities, tribal treaties reserve rights to fish in perpetuity, whereas those state laws require the conservation of the public's fish. I do believe it was Judge Marsh that noted that there's many interests in the Columbia River Basin, but there's only one right. In the United States v. Oregon case, that clarifies the treaty and non-treaty sharing of harvestable fish and hatchery production. And the ESA, the Endangered Species Act, provides for the federal oversight, whether it's a threatened or endangered stock or population. Unless explicitly preempted by a federal statute, the CRTFIC tribes retain sovereignty over their tribal members, their tribal lands, and those tribal reserved activities, fishing again being a good example of that. In looking at the management approach that the tribes have taken, we often term this as the gravel-to-gravel approach. This is identified in the tribe's management plan by Kanishmewa-Kishwit, translated as the Spirit of the Salmon, first produced in 1995, but also updated in 2014. Here's a link that can take you directly to that report. One of the main goals was to reach 4 million salmon returning by 2020. Did we reach that goal? We definitely did not hit 4 million salmon this year. We've gotten close, definitely within the last decade, but as you're probably aware that salmon runs are fairly stochastic. They occur within a range, and there's still quite a ways to go. If you look at the losses assessment, I think that the Power Council put out in 1986, the historical estimate of what the Columbia River used to be able to produce is somewhere between, I do believe, 9 to 16 million fish of different species and seasonal races. Just a little more information about CRTFIC. Our main office is in Portland, Oregon, but we also have an enforcement division, and if you're ever driving out to Hood River, you can actually see where our enforcement office is along the highway there. We have a genetics lab based out of Hagerman, Idaho, in partnership with the University of Idaho, and we even have some staff based at the University of Idaho in Moscow that are doing physiology work with steelhead in various parts of the Snake River Basin. So to close, oftentimes people can view tribal perspectives in a historical context, and definitely it's important to understand the historical, legal, and cultural context of how we got to here today. But also still important that our tie to this landscape, being part of this ecosystem, whether it's salmon or something else, it's still who we are. So thanks for your time and attention. Appreciate the opportunity to speak.